Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome this evening. Welcome to Evening with Dr. Irving-Stonebraker. My name is Stephen Liggins. I'm one of the ministers here at this church, and it's great to have you with us. One of the aims of tonight is to sort of provide an opportunity for us to think about some spiritual issues in a way which will be of interest to everyone, whether you consider yourself a Christian or not a Christian or you're unsure. I hope that tonight will be of interest and stimulus to you wherever you are. Now, let me quickly explain the format of the evening before I introduce you to Dr. Irving-Stonebraker in a moment. In a moment, I'm going to invite Sarah to come up. Then I'm going to interview her for about 35 or 40 minutes, till about 8:20 or thereabouts. Then we're going to break for supper for 20 minutes. And after that, we're going to come back. I'll make a few short announcements, and then we'll do some questions and answers. Now, if you'd like to send in a question, the easiest way to do that is via Slido on your mobile phones. How do you operate that? Well, just go to your search engine, put in that address, Slido/Stonebreaker, in the way it's set out, put your question there. Now, if that is too much for you, and you just find that too emotionally disturbing to do, just come up to me in the break and say, Steve, what about this question? And I'll make a note of it, okay? So we can do that by Slido. It's probably the easiest thing, but feel free to just ask me if you have any questions which you'd like to throw in. We should be finished by about 9:15 or 9:20. Now, just so that you know, if you need the bathrooms, they're just in the hall behind the back wall. You can either exit via that door or that door and make your way to it. Also, as you can see tonight, it's being interpreted into Auslan. Other than that, I'm now going to tell you a bit about our guest tonight, Dr. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker. Sarah grew up in Sydney. She went to the University of Sydney, where she did history and actually won the University Medal for history when she went through. She then went on and did her PhD at Cambridge University before working after that at Oxford University, then at Florida State University in the United States of America. She is currently senior lecturer in modern European history at Western Sydney University. The first book which she wrote, which was Natural Science and the Origins of the British Empire, it was awarded the Royal Society of Literature and Jerwood Foundation Award for non-fiction. Now, that obviously means that was a very well-regarded book. At the start of her academic career in history, she would have described herself as an atheist. These days, she is a Christian. She's married. She has 3 children. She lives not too far from here. Would you please welcome Dr. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you for making the trip up the hill to see us.
Thank you.
Now, I think people have probably grasped now that you're very interested in history. So I'm wondering whether you could tell us a bit about your early history, your family, where you grew up.
Yeah, sure. So, as you mentioned, I was born here in Sydney. I grew up in a really loving non-Christian family. On the North Shore of Sydney, had a really lovely childhood, and it was a family that loved and cherished the world of ideas. So my father was also a historian, still is a historian, and was a professor at the University of Sydney. And so this meant that childhood meal times around the table, we're always discussing history, we're discussing politics, we're discussing ideas, and I'd spend my school holidays often going in with Dad to the university, and I do my school assignments and projects using books from the Fisher Library. And I think just if you guys have seen the University of Sydney, there's that beautiful Gothic sandstone quadrangle. And I think as a young child, gazing at that beautiful quadrangle, it symbolised for me just the wonder and the kind of awe I had for the world of ideas. So anyway, it was very much like, in terms of my early history, it was very much a loving childhood, but a very, very, very secular one. Because even though parents were non-Christian, they were very, very politically and socially aware. So I was always thinking and talking about ideas.
Okay. Now, I was going to ask you, where did your interest in history come from? Was it just from your father, or was it from anywhere else?
Look, I think a lot of it was from constantly being read to and having those kinds of conversations with Dad. But there was also a kind of formative experience, actually. So when I was 8 years old, my family went on an overseas trip. We spent several months, actually, in England and America. Dad was on sabbatical leave. And in England, I was taken through, we saw, as you do, of course, beautiful medieval castles. We spent time at the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge. I saw towns and villages that were old enough to be in William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book, the book that was written to kind of record, almost like a census, all the kind of the villages in 1066. And that trip was so formative for me because it gave me this sense that history was this fascinating, mesmerising, enchanting, sort of the past is another country, and it was a country I wanted to explore.
Yeah. Just stop for a minute. Is that sound coming out okay?
I'm just going to interrupt you for a minute.
Yep.
We're going to get you another mic on the stand. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. It's cutting in and out, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's this microphone. So
Turn it on.
one of those things where it worked up until the moment you all arrived.
Yes, it worked a few minutes ago.
If you want to just do some stand-up or something, Stephen.
Yeah. What's brown and sticky? A stick. Yeah. What do you call the? No eyes. No idea. What do you tell a deer with no eyes and a Santa's hat? Still no jolly idea. Yeah, good. I could go on. So.
You can probably hear me if I speak loudly and project my voice. Okay.
No. Well, I think a microphone is about to be here in one moment, I think, so we'll wait for that. Why don't you happily talk amongst yourselves just for a minute? Otherwise, I will just be saying whatever comes into my head, and that could mean anything.
Hold this for a second. I'll get you to stand so you don't have to keep holding it.
Okay, I'll just start speaking in a few minutes. This is quite good, isn't it?
And mine's still going okay? Yeah. Okay. So, Sarah, you just explained that your father was an historian. You'd been on this trip to England. You'd seen these incredible historical buildings and such forth. You're at school. What was your path towards becoming an historian?
Well, so that trip to England made me realise that becoming a historian, and especially going to study at Oxford and Cambridge, became my goal in life. Kind of a dream, really, from Australia. So that meant that throughout school, I was one of those people who's very driven and very motivated, and so I worked really hard because I knew that in order to get into Cambridge, I'd need to get very good marks and a scholarship and so forth. And in terms of...
Sorry.
That's all right. There we go.
I'll just...
Yeah. Yeah. So I had to work very hard. And I think actually, looking back on it, in many ways, this shaped in me a kind of sense that I didn't need God. Because, if you ask me, well, where was God? Did you ever think about God through all of this? And I've obviously asked myself that question looking back sometimes. I'd say that I actually felt like life was entirely what you make of it, and therefore that I didn't really need God. And so I worked very, very hard, did very well at school, went on to the University of Sydney, got the university medal, and then anyway, got the marks that enabled me to win that scholarship to Cambridge. And so then there I was in Cambridge. And so there was this funny sense in which, almost like a secular idea of providence in a way, what I mean by that is that there was almost this sense that life really was fulfilling my dreams, and there was some kind of purpose to it, even though I didn't believe there was a God. Because when I arrived in Cambridge, there'd always been this dream since I was 9 that that's where I would end up. And in fact, when I was a child on that trip to England, my parents took a photograph of my brother and I standing. It's a place where a lot of tourists take photographs. There's a beautiful, many sandstone bridges over the River Cam, and one in King's College is particularly scenic and picturesque. And so there's a photograph of my brother and I standing there. I'm in a little kilt and I'm 9 years old. And in the background of that photograph is a 16th century building called Bodley's Court. And then whatever it was, 12, 13 years later, you can see the bedroom that would eventually become mine when I was a student there.
In that photograph?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
wow. Okay. Now, does that sound now sorted for everyone? Yeah, great. Okay. So you're now at Cambridge. Your dreams are coming true. You're describing yourself as an atheist at this point. Did you have a God of any sort?
Well, I think looking back on it, I did, in the sense that everybody lives for something. There is something, even when I would have thought, I don't believe in God in terms of a divine being, but in a sense I did live for something. There was something which for me was ultimate, which gave me my sense of self-worth, which gave me a sense of what life was all about. And that was this sense that achievement or success of some form, following my dreams, was going to be what ultimately made life worth living. And so in that sense, of course, there was something which was ultimate for me. It just wasn't God, and I wouldn't have called it a God.
Yeah. So things are looking pretty good for you. You're living out your dreams. How did that start to change?
Well, the first thing I think that happened that was significant is that when I was at Cambridge, the topic of my PhD thesis was, funnily enough, on some of the early natural, well, we'd call them scientists today. They were called natural philosophers back in the 17th century, 1600s, and their relationship to the British Empire. But the more I began to read these natural philosophers, so these are people like Robert Boyle, who's now credited to be one of the founders of modern chemistry, Robert Hooke, really one of the founders of and developed the microscope, wrote tons on the experimental method. And the funny thing is that the more I read of what I thought was their scientific work, the more I realised that what they were talking about over and over again that framed everything was theology. So, for example, I remember one day I was reading a work by Robert Boyle, which is a scientific work. It's basically a debate that he has with Aristotle about how we should understand the natural world, and it's called A Disquisition on the Final Causes of Natural Things. Basically, what Boyle's saying in that is we need to understand how things work rather than their purpose. But the upshot of all that was that throughout all of this, Boyle was quoting the Bible. He quoted Psalm 8, for example. Now, I had to go to my Bible to look at what Psalm 8 was all about. It was all about how humanity was created in God's image, and God had made humanity a little lower than the angels and yet had given man the responsibility for the rest of creation. And so I'm sitting there, this 23-year-old, highly intelligent atheist, trying to make sense of why this scientist kept talking about the Bible and what that had to do with everything. And then you read, I can talk about this more and, maybe people have questions about it, but I started to read Robert Hooke and it was the same thing. And so, look, this didn't make me a Christian or anything, but it was like a pebble in my shoe, because what it made me realise was that what I'd always assumed was a conflict between science and Christianity was, in fact, perhaps not a conflict at all, at least when it came to the origins of modern science. And secondly, another assumption that I always had, which was that perhaps Christianity was just a kind of window dressing for these philosophers.
Like everyone was a Christian back
Yeah,
in
everyone
those
was a
days.
Christian in those days, so perhaps they were just kind of paying lip service to the dominant ideology of the day. But the more I read of their work, the more I realised that actually, no, this was genuine. Boyle's work, for example, is just so richly structured by discussions of biblical texts, and he's grappling with ideas about what humanity was made for and how that fits into God's purpose for humanity and why we should study the natural world and so forth. So it meant really that I couldn't dismiss Christianity in the way that I had been dismissing it. I'm going to turn a little bit more to this side of the room too. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so some of the greats of science, they were Christians. That you maybe thought, I always thought there may have been a conflict, but apparently it wasn't for these gentlemen.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Now, what happened then? What was the next sort of event which sparked your thinking?
Well, at this time in my life, everything seems to be kind of fulfilling a plan that I'd had for my life. And in fact, things kept going really, really well. And after I finished my PhD, then the next kind of dream that I had was to get a research fellowship, which I did at Oxford. But then things started to change. So by this time, sort of more like mid-20s, 25 or so. And one day, my friends and I heard, when we were at Oxford, that the very famous atheist philosopher, Peter Singer, who's also Australian, and at that time was a professor at Princeton, was coming to give a series of named the Hero lectures, guest lectures, at Oxford on ethics. And so a bunch of friends and I went along, and I was really, really excited because even though I was an atheist, I hadn't read too much about atheism at that point. And so I kind of just assumed that everything I'd hear at those lectures would encourage me and just kind of confirm my kind of basic, sort of what I thought were atheist beliefs in the world, about the world. However, that series of lectures effectively changed everything for me, because Singer was, very logically consistent in all of his arguments. But basically what he does is he pursues the implications of atheist ethics to the point of their sort of logical extreme, as it were, in the sense that he is at heart questioning, well, to what extent do we actually have duties towards others? And eventually this gets to the question of, well, do we actually have any duties towards humanity on the basis that human life is sacred or inherently precious and of equal moral worth? And what that means, by the way, is that, is the life of a very weak or sick individual or somebody of different race or whatever, are all human lives of equal value? And basically, Singer's argument is, well, that's a Christian assumption about the world, and that actually, if you want to be purely rational, as he would call it, an atheist, and just assume that the ultimate reality is just biological, and that human beings are just effectively a more highly evolved primate, then there's nothing inherently precious about human life. And moreover, that there's nothing inherently equal about human life either. Because, of course, when you look at the natural world, there's a vast hierarchy of human capacities and human abilities or disabilities. And so this idea, basically, it took the carpet from underneath me, as it were. It kind of gave me this sense of intellectual vertigo, because these are ideas that were sort of my moral intuitions, and here it was very clear that atheism couldn't sustain them, and that basically what I'd done is assume a sense of, I'd kind of secularised them in the sense that I'd taken the God content or the theological content out of them, but I basically had a series of Christian assumptions about the nature of human life. And so after that series of lectures, and particularly talking with the friends that I went with, and reading more about Singer, I basically began to realise that atheism had effectively failed me intellectually, in the sense that it couldn't sustain any of my basic moral intuitions, chief among which was that all human life was inherently precious on the basis that it is human. There's something precious and sacred about human life. And the other one was that all human lives are of equal worth. I didn't believe that my life was any more or less valuable than anyone else's. And here was atheism, and it couldn't sustain this.
Now, I imagine there'd be many people who are atheists who would think that human life is valuable and that all humans are equal in value. What would you say about that?
Well, okay, so you can sort of go two places with that. The first is to say you can just kind of take that as a basic assumption and say that, look, we need to kind of agree on this as a premise for our discussion to continue. But it's not a premise that you can ground, in the sense that it's not a premise that you can actually, like if you're an atheist, it's not a premise that's grounded by biology. And in fact, Richard Dawkins, for example, has, and other new atheists agree that you can't ground that in biology, and Singer's not the only philosopher. Like, it's a fairly standard philosophical point that, and I think actually I could paraphrase Singer when he says that the sanctity of human life is not something that can be rationally defended. So anyway, so you can't rationally defend it, but you could just kind of say, look, all reasonable people assume this. And actually, that was probably what I would have said before I realised that, yeah, you couldn't actually ground it on anything. And I guess the second response to that is to do what Singer does, and which is to say, okay, well, if we want to talk about human ethics, what we need to do is come up with a series of capacities that do enable us to think about on what basis we can talk about human value and human rights. And so Singer's approach to that, and he's not alone in this, is to come up with a kind of criteria. So it's basically to say, well, what is it that really distinguishes humans from other animals biologically? And that is things like our capacity to reason, our ability to experience deep suffering and to actually be aware of that, self-consciousness, things like that. But the problem that raises is, of course, there are humans who don't have those capacities, right? They're very, very young, they're very, very old, they're very sick, they're disabled, and so forth. So then what happens to those people if what Singer calls personhood, which is the basis for sort of talking about human value, becomes something that you can't actually universally apply to all humans? And that's something that I found troubling too.
Yeah. And from looking at history, would it be the case that if you go outside of Christian culture, no one believed in equality between people? No one thought that all human lives were valuable?
Yeah.
Would that be a fair comment?
Yes, particularly in the ancient world. I mean, this is the funny thing. I think often in the West we tend to forget this, partly because we don't know a whole lot about our history, particularly ancient history, and partly also because we live so much in the legacy of Christian thought, as it were, that we tend to think that thinking that, say, taking care of the weak and the vulnerable is a good thing, and the idea that the powerful have obligations towards the weak, the idea that humility is a virtue, all of these things are actually Christian developments. And in the ancient world, they were utterly contemptuous to Greek and Roman philosophy, where the idea was, and you can, read Plotinus and people like this, that basically the powerful deserve to be powerful. Yeah.
Okay, so you're at university, your science, and study of science history has made you think. You've went and heard Peter Singer speak. You've reasoned from that. You've been a bit disturbed by the implications of some of the things he said. What happened next in terms of your spiritual pilgrimage?
Well then, so that was all very intellectual, as it were, but then there was also a sense in which atheism was also failing me in a more personal way. And what I mean by that is that, as I alluded to before, I basically lived this life of kind of ultimate self-creation, in the sense that I'd thought that life was all about the sort of inventing my own sort of destiny, fulfilling my dreams and so forth. But what actually happened is that even though, basically to sort of use the cliche, but it works, like even though every dream was kind of coming true, what was increasingly apparent is that it was never actually satisfying. It was never actually fulfilling, that everything that you achieve actually just places you at the bottom of another ladder. And so, once I'd gotten to Cambridge, which I'd always just thought was the ultimate goal, then of course you have to get the PhD, then you want to get the book, and then you want to get the job, and then you want to get and then you just need more and more. So basically I was also kind of thinking, what's going on in my life when I am effectively empty, despite the fact that I have everything? There's just this kind of emptiness.
So did you search around? What happened? Was anything resonating with you at this point?
Well, I think one of the things that the experience of thinking about the Singer lectures was that it made Christianity far more attractive to me, because it made me realise how beautiful and how unique those ideas about the care of the most vulnerable, the idea of humility, and it just made those ideas really attractive. But I didn't really want to pick up a Bible or anything. But I remember that one winter in Oxford, when very few people are in colleges in Oxford over the winter, because most people just go home. However, I was there in winter. I think it was actually even Boxing Day, and I was sitting in my college library and very restless, and I turned around and I saw that actually all the shelves of books that were nearest to my desk were the theology section. And so I just wandered about in the shelves and I was really curious, and I picked up what was a book of sermons and just began to read. And what really struck me about the sermons was that there was a picture of humanity and of who God was that was so compelling and far richer and deeper than I'd ever, in my arrogance, to be honest, than I'd ever actually realised. And in particular, I think this sermon quoted Psalm 139, which actually gave the complete, it's almost as if it gave the opposite image of humanity, which Singer gave, where we're sort of just the more highly developed primate. But Psalm 139, I remember reading, saying that it was you, God, who formed me, fashioning me in my mother's wombs, who formed my internal organs. And then I went on in that sermon to read more about what that meant. But basically it was this picture of the preciousness of life, not something that I have to achieve for myself, but something that is actually given to me or to anyone because of the fact that God forms us and God creates us. And I remember finding that just so compelling and intriguing and so different to everything, like very much in the culture, and I think it's still very much the case in this culture where you think that everything in life is the meaning that we create for ourselves. And how different it was reading a psalm which said that God gives us our meaning and our value. And suddenly I thought, maybe I don't have to think that I have to create my own self-worth anymore, because in effect, when I looked around and I saw the way that most of my friends, who weren't Christians either, lived, it's what we were all doing really. It was trying to create our own self-worth in some way or another, living for something that we thought would give us ultimate meaning.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned there that you said amongst your friendship circle, you didn't know many Christians. When and where did you come into contact with Christians?
I perhaps knew one or two at Oxford and Cambridge. But then, okay, so the next thing really is that I immigrated to America because I got a job at Florida State University. And another new faculty member there gave me a book by C.S. Lewis, who was also an atheist, so that really appealed to me, called Mere Christianity. And I read Mere Christianity and I remember thinking how incredibly reasonable and logical it was. And that I found really appealing. And then one Sunday, I decided by myself, and I think in some ways I needed the ability to not have people around to decide that I would actually go into church by myself. But I decided I'd go to church. And so I found a church in Tallahassee, and I walked into this church. And actually, the church was a very traditional service, and walking into that church actually struck me as being nothing like the world that I was living in, which was completely, because I was an atheist, so I didn't believe that there was anything sacred or transcendent, anything outside of this world. So the world that I thought existed was nothing really but matter in motion, nothing but what we can see and feel and touch and we perhaps know to exist, waves and quarks and so forth, but that there is nothing transcendent or sacred. And yet I walked into this church and they were celebrating what's called, I learned, the Lord's Supper. And I remember the choir was singing a hymn by Ralph Vaughan Williams, the Welsh composer, and I think I knew that hymn. And there was something so incredibly familiar and yet so hauntingly different about this service that it took me out of the mundane. It took me out of this very flat material world in which I lived and invited me into, and this is the thing about what happens in what's called the Lord's Supper. So the words that were spoken are to remember the fact that Jesus, before he died, gives bread and wine to his disciples and says, this is effectively like, this is my body, which is broken for you. and this is my blood which is poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. And I remember being in that church and realising that suddenly I was taken out of myself and invited into a story in which, thank goodness I wasn't the centre, invited into a story, a transcendent story in which there was a God at the centre, a God who becomes human in order to die and in order to make somebody like me who was at that time so, like in many ways, naive and arrogant despite whatever gifts or talents I had, and was searching and made fun of Christians all the time, and yet God's offer that I could actually be made right with him was entirely at his own expense, and that offer was for me. And suddenly in that church I felt maybe there was something more to life, and that it wasn't about me, it was about God.
Yeah. So you're starting to hear about what Jesus has done for you, for his
Yep.
death and resurrection. What about the people at the church? Did you notice anything about them?
Yes. At that church and the other Christians that knew them in Tallahassee, I sort of began to meet them. And the Christians I met were living lives that were very different to the way that I lived. So this was by no means to suggest that they were sort of perfect people or anything like that. And they certainly, weirdly enough, they weren't actually moralising, but they just quietly did things like there was a soup kitchen, for example, in this downtown church in Tallahassee. And they were actually taking care of the most vulnerable and the most needy. And the more that I learned about why they did that, and the more that I learned about Jesus, the more that I was struck by Jesus's character, which is that he is somebody who spends all his time with the people who need him most, who are the most vulnerable and the most needy and the most marginalised and the social outcasts. And I began to see Christians who, in all their flaws, were trying to live differently, and that appealed to me too. I wanted to live in a way that wasn't for myself.
So there's been quite a process from, your PhD, through Singer, through this church, through meeting people, hearing about Jesus at the Lord's Supper.
Yep.
At what point did you think you decided to become a follower of Jesus and seek his forgiveness? Was there a point, or did you sort of float into that?
Yeah, I think, look, this whole process, well, even while I was in Tallahassee, this whole process goes on for months and months. I mean, this is quite a slow process. There's lots of reading going on. I'm reading other sermons, and eventually I'm reading the Bible too. But I do remember one night when I decided that it was about time to make this decision to follow Jesus. And so just in my closet, as they call it in America, it was like a walk-in, we'd say a wardrobe. But it's the most kind of, personal place, I suppose. And then I did pray that prayer one night that said that that I want to be part of God's people, that Jesus had saved me, and that I knew that I'd lived a life scoffing at God and at his followers, and that I needed forgiveness, that I was a very kind of broken person, and that I needed God, and that I wanted that offer of forgiveness to count for me. So I did do that one night. I do remember that.
Okay. Then how did that affect things in the days, weeks, months which followed?
And even years.
Years.
Yeah.
Decades.
Yeah. This is the thing. I mean, I think it's tempting in a culture in which I think the culture we live in is very much about sort of self-help and wellness. And I think one of the temptations when we think about, and certainly when I reflect on Christianity and try to explain it to people who ask me and to friends, is that we're tempted to think that this is going to be a kind of a wellness thing or a self-help doctrine or something like that. But actually, the reality is that the Bible is not about, and God's offer to us is not about making our lives better or easier. And that actually, even though, there's that false idea out there that, become a Christian and there's health and there's wealth, and it's not what the Bible promises at all. Actually, Jesus lived a life of suffering, but that kind of suffering is actually what points to the truth about human life and life as a Christian, which is that there will still be suffering. However, we have a God who promises that this suffering is not the end, and that he is with us in our suffering. And so I think when I reflect on however many years it's been since I've been a Christian, one of the things that I think has changed most for me is how I try to think about, and not just my own, or family or friends, but other people's suffering too, is how we actually deal with hardship and suffering. Because I think before I was a Christian, when I was an atheist, there was no explanation of suffering. There's no ultimate explanation of suffering. And suffering is always horrible. It doesn't get any less. It's not as if God says suffering is not horrible as a Christian. But having become a Christian, it actually enables me to have a God who has actually suffered ultimately, and who is there in my suffering, and who wants me to be with others in their suffering. Because I could go. But because this suffering is not actually the end.
Okay.
Yeah, this world is not the end.
So you've become a follower of Jesus. It's been working its way through your thinking and your life. You're still a historian though, aren't you?
Yes.
How did becoming a Christian in any way impact on your academic study of history?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think really the first thing to say about history is that the methodologies of history are still the methodologies of history, in the sense it's still a secular discipline. But actually, in the kind of broader and more personal sense about thinking about how, as a historian, I think about human history in the past, what I've realised is that Christianity provides me with the tools to understand what's actually happening in the past, the analytic vocabulary, if you see what I mean. What I mean by that is, when I study different civilizations and human societies, one thing, there are patterns that emerge, and the best way of understanding the pattern of human societies that are deeply kind of morally, and every society is full of all kinds of oppression and injustice, and in which individual historical figures are morally flawed and have moral failures, and yet at the same time there are these yearnings that every society has for to create a good society, even though it looks different in different societies, and many of them miss the mark, some horrendously so. Some miss the mark so far that it leads to genocide. But there are ultimate kind of principles of yearning for things like beauty and justice and love. And being a Christian enables me as a historian to understand these kind of deep patterns of the human condition, I think, which is that we are made in God's image, that we have implanted in our hearts desires for and a kind of yearning for justice, but that in different human societies, this can lead us to miss the mark in all kinds of different ways.
Okay. I'm wondering whether I could perhaps ask about 3 more questions before we have our break, and I'd just be interested in your reflections on a few things.
Yeah, sure.
Science and Christianity.
Okay.
It's often discussed today, is there a conflict between science and Christianity? Do you have any reflections on science and Christianity?
Yeah. Okay, so this is a really, really broad topic. I think one of the things that I've learned about this relationship, particularly because then, funnily enough, I ended up teaching topics on this to undergraduate students as a historian of science and Christianity, but particularly about the origins of modern science, that modern science depends upon the idea that there is patterned intelligibility in the universe, that there is order which the human mind can understand. And then when you look at things like mathematics, for example, all of these things, they rely upon the idea that the human mind can grasp something and can make sense of the world. But the idea that the world ought to be ordered and meaningful and intelligible by humanity relies upon the idea that there is a God who is the foundation of order. And I guess the other kind of reflection, and maybe people have more questions later, so I'll try to keep it short, is really more about my own historical period on the origins of modern science, which I get really excited about. In particular because really modern science, even though we don't often realise it today, relied upon other Christian assumptions about the world too, which is that that the natural world is really there in order to, and that humans have a kind of responsibility to steward the natural world and make it useful for the purposes of human life. I think I'm probably quoting Robert Boyle there. But that's not, we might kind of take that as a very kind of basic assumption. We might not think that's remarkable, but that's only because we live in the legacy of these ideas. That's not how the pre-Christian world thought about the natural world at all. And so there's an incredible, and there are all kinds of modern scientists like Francis Collins, who led the team that sequenced the human genome, for example, or all kinds of incredible Christian scientists who can speak in their own field about the relationship between Christianity and science.
Yeah, thank you. Now, another question, a reflection on history and Jesus. So the Bible describes things about Jesus, life, death, resurrection, teaching. You're a historian. Do you have any reflections on the historicity of that?
This has been so interesting for me to read about as a historian, so not an ancient historian, but actually to read about because as a historian, it's in many ways the kind of evidence you're looking for is the kind of evidence which paints the best picture, which is the most reliable. In that sense, you know, the way that we think about evidence and testimony as historians is kind of similar to that in a court of law. Like what makes for the most reliable and best account? And a few things really strike me about the reliability of the Gospels, for example. I think one of my favourite ones is the fact that when you read the Gospel sources, they are very much not shaped in such a way that you would expect them to be shaped if they were kind of making up an attractive story to kind of convince an audience about somebody that they, you know, believed and invented was God. Because the idea that Jesus would spend his time with the social outcasts, for example, the idea that Jesus would be executed on a cross, which is incredibly humiliating, the idea that you'd have women who in the first century Jewish communities, their testimony wasn't allowed in a court of law because the idea was that women weren't reliable witnesses, and yet the Gospels credit women witnessing the empty tomb. You don't put this stuff in there if you're making it up. And when you look at the Jesus's disciples, they are not the glorious figures that you might read about in the classic kind of Greco-Roman biographies. I mean, they're flawed and they're petty, and Thomas is doubting, and Peter denies Jesus. You don't put that in there if you're making this stuff up.
Yeah. And then perhaps just a final question before we go to our break. Very big question. What would you describe as your aim or aims in life today?
I am somebody who is at heart forgiven, and so forgiven and made right with God. And so what that means is that there's no aim that I can have that will ever achieve heaven for me or ever achieve salvation. Everything in terms of being made right with God has been absolutely done with Jesus. And yet, so that is how I'm made right with God, and yet God has given me all kinds of opportunities, and so I want to live a life now in which I can try to do what Jesus asks all of his followers humbly to do in their own different walks of life, regardless of whether they're an academic or a teacher or a hairdresser or whatever, which is to try to tell others about him, to try to get alongside others and care for them and take care of other people and tell them about the gospel. And so in all different callings in life, so as a historian, I'm trying to write the best history I can, and as an academic to take care of my students, and as a public Christian, and also of course as a wife and as a mother, all different walks of life. My aim is I've been saved, I'm completely forgiven, and so now God has elected all people in our different ways to serve. So how can I go out and to serve him?
Well, thank you. I think that's all very helpful. I think we might have a break now. Supper is on. And remember, please do send in any questions for our Q&A to the Slido address on the screen, or if you're unable to do that, sidle up to me and just tell me what your question is. But Slido will be very helpful. And then we'll reconvene in about 20 minutes or so. So there we go. That's a bit of a... Hopefully that will whet your appetite. We ran the course a few months ago. It went very well. So I recommend that course to you should you or someone you know be interested. Now, we've got quite a few questions which have come in on Slido, and I've also had a number of questions given to me personally, and unfortunately we're not going to get through all of them because I do plan to finish in about 20 minutes or so. But I'll try and get a selection and a cross-section, particularly focusing on those topics which Sarah was addressing earlier. So I might start off with this one. It has to do with historical evidence, and here it is. Is there any piece of historical evidence that stuck out to you in support of the Bible's teachings and narrative, or perhaps against the Bible's teaching and narrative? So I'll read it again. Is there any piece of historical evidence that stuck out to you in support of the Bible's teachings and narrative?
Yeah, okay. Oh, gosh, okay. I'll try to keep it short. I think from within the Bible, one of the things that I've found most striking is a line that in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church in chapter 15, where he talks about the fact that in Jerusalem, over 500 people saw the risen Christ. And then he says in his letter to people that he's writing, many of whom are still alive today. And, he's claimed that they're in Jerusalem. And the reason that stuck out to me is that this is basically Paul writing a letter to a bunch of people who could go to Jerusalem fairly easily and check this out for themselves. I mean, he's making a claim there that you could actually test. And to claim that there are, especially in the 1st century AD in a city like Jerusalem, many of 500 people who are still alive and can attest to this is basically saying, go and check this out for yourself. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'll just stay on the history theme for the moment. The question is, did you investigate the historical evidence for Jesus before you became a Christian? And then it says, if so, what were your reasons not to believe the historical evidence, presumably before you became a Christian?
Yeah.
I think the first part of the question is the main thing. Did you investigate the historical evidence for Jesus before you became a Christian, and how did that influence you?
That's a really good question. No, I didn't. And I think the reason why I didn't is that if it were the case that Christianity could just be proven historically, we wouldn't have gotten to, and that God intended there to be just complete proof and there to be no question, then we wouldn't be in the year, whatever it was, 2008 or even 2020, whatever, because it's clear, and even I knew this when I was investigating history, that the nature of God's relationship with us is that he wants us, he's revealed himself to us, and he's given us the best understanding, the best kind of explanation of who he is and who Christ claimed to be and who he was. But it's never going to be provable, and so the idea that we'd turn and find absolute complete historical proof or something wasn't something that I was interested in, because that's not what faith is about. And I think partly, so therefore the question was always for me, and this is why we can still look and question, well, what is the historical evidence for Jesus? Does it stand up? There are many great books on that, and I'm still reading them today. So the question is not, can you prove it, but rather, what is the best kind of fit for the evidence, the testimony, and is it reliable? And that is a question that I think is really well worth asking. And that's something that I did ask, yeah.
Perhaps you mentioned there are some books which you've read on historical reliability or otherwise of the Bible.
Yep.
Are there any one or two which you might recommend for just general reading?
Yeah. John Dixon, a year or two ago, Is Jesus History? Yep. That's great.
Okay, so that would be a good one to look at. Okay, so we'll change tack a bit from history and think about you and your, your career. Sarah, as an educator in a secular institution, how do you give voice to your faith
with your students and colleagues? Or, how does your faith, how do you give voice to it? And the person says, I'm a teacher in a public school.
Yeah.
So that's where the question's coming from.
That is such a good question because, of course, I'm currently in a secular university as well. And I suspect, therefore, that we're both, like many others, in context in which you can't and you're not supposed to sort of share the gospel, as it were, in the classroom. So what I have done is to try to speak and to treat my students in such a way that that those who have questions will ask the questions. And that's actually happened quite a lot. So like outside of the classroom. So the situation I'm in is one in which I can talk about it if I'm asked, particularly outside of the classroom. And over the years, I have had a lot of students ask me. And also the more that I've become public about my faith, which was a decision a few years ago to just, for various personal reasons, to actually be more public about being a Christian. The more that I do that, the more that if any of the students Google me, they find that I'm a Christian. So then they kind of ask me questions. And I try to speak in such a way where I present so part of what I do in terms of the history that I teach is that I teach the history of Christianity, and I never gloss over the evil that's being committed in the name of Christianity, but I also kind of point out the kind of standards to which we have to hold Christianity and the fact that they're biblical standards in the first place. So, for example, the idea that the powerful have obligations to care for the poor and the weak is actually a Christian idea. So let's hold the church up to that. So we can, when we're trying to think about the good and evil in the past and what that means for Christianity, to try to teach in such a way that shows that there's a kind of a robustness to the Christian faith and a kind of beauty where even though Christians fall short, the ideal that Christ gives us is that to which even secular people are striving. So I think that's how I try to do that.
Now, I think you've also partially answered another question, or a couple of questions which have come up, but I'll just re-ask it and you perhaps can clarify it.
Yep.
I think there's one or two questions about how do you account for some of the horrible things Christians have done throughout history. I mean, how do you deal with that?
That is such a good question and such an important question too. And I think even as an atheist, it was a question that I had, and one of the things that led me to kind of dismiss Christianity at first. I think one of the first couple of things to say is that even the Bible's account of who humanity is an account which makes very clear right from the beginning that even though humankind is made in God's image, human beings, we expect moral failure because human beings are corrupt and sinful, even Christians. And so actually the Bible's very clear about the fact that there's always been this darkness in the human character. You read the Old Testament, for example, and there's all kinds of violence and horrific injustice and oppression and so forth, precisely because the Bible's painting a picture in which human beings are moral failures. And so I wouldn't even biblically expect that Christians would always be perfect people. The idea is that they're forgiven people. Okay, so that's one thing. And then even in the New Testament, in Paul's letters, he talks about the fact that some will preach the gospel out of envy and selfish ambition. And of course, historically, there have been all kinds of, evils committed in the name of Christianity. But so the first thing is to realise that, this is what we expect biblically. And then I think the second important thing that I think about is that, and I think maybe this is best played out if I look at a particular historical example. So if you look at the history of, say, the slave trade in the British Empire, and the reason why that's such a good example of good and evil committed in the name of Christianity is that the slave trade, completely evil in the British Empire. There were just attempts to justify slavery in the name of Christianity, and was committed by people who claimed to be Christians. And yet, so all the moral failure, and yet when the slave trade, when there was a big move to abolish the slave trade in the empire, which begins the late 18th century, it begins by a bunch of evangelical Christians, led by William Wilberforce and some others, a woman called Hannah More. And what they're trying to do is to say, hold on, you have completely misunderstood, you Christians, quote unquote, and of course complete slave trade has been practiced by every civilization in every society. And in fact, more humans are trafficked today than historically. But anyway, that actually this is being committed, but actually Christianity ought to be the absolute reason why they argued you need to abolish slavery. And the argument to abolish slavery in the empire was made on the basis that humankind are created in God's image. And even the image that was used as the popular kind of image on all the kind of on the posters and the pamphlets and the Wedgwood ceramics of the time was a picture of a slave in shackles with the phrase, "Am I not a man and a brother?" which alludes to the fact that all people bear God's image and therefore they can't be enslaved. Anyway, so the point about that is when you kind of assess the fact that, yes, sin has been committed in the name of Christianity, is that the standards to which we are assessing that sin in the first place are Christian standards. So in other words, the reason why we know that slavery is inherently wrong, and in fact, historically, the arguments that slavery has been wrong, first is by Gregory of Nyssa in the 5th century AD. And the argument is because humanity is created in God's image and the master and the slave are equal. So it's that when there is sin, it's because we have not actually read the Bible well enough.
Okay. Now, you're involved in lecturing and education. I'm going to go to one of the handwritten questions I received. The question is it possible that better learning, thinking and reasoning could lead this troubled world to a better place? So I guess the idea is that would learning, thinking, reasoning, education, could that make this troubled world a better place?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Look, learning and thinking and reasoning are things that, like, God has given us all a mind. And the story of Jacob in the Old Testament wrestling with God, God wants us to use our mind and use our intelligence. And it's through our intelligence that we're supposed to educate ourselves about God and the world. And I think that, though, that at the heart of that question, however, is the sense that, well, can't we just educate ourselves and create the ideal society through education, as opposed to, like, do we really need God to tell us what this ideal society looks like, as it were? Won't education just kind of solve that? And there I think that won't work. And the reason is that historically, look, every society, well, many societies, many civilizations, and they've led to enormous kind of improvements and progress. But education on its own has no goal. Like, if we don't understand what learning is for, and we have no kind of answer to the bigger questions about, well, do we use our better scientific knowledge to help others, or do we use our increased understanding of the way the world works to create a just, and what does the just society look like? What does God want? Then we have nothing but ourselves to basically invent where all that education is leading to. And the societies historically that have pursued, I mean, communist Russia and Nazi Germany have both been pretty good examples of societies, and even contemporary China, that pursue education but unhinged from any sense that God is, and that following God is the goal of all of our learning, and it leads to horrific consequences.
Okay. Now I might go to a changing tack a bit, a slightly more personal question. I think the question was roughly along the lines of, you know, your family was not a Christian family. Many of your friends weren't Christians. When you became a follower of Jesus, you know, how was that received amongst your broader family and broader friendship group?
Yeah, that's a good question.
To the extent that you feel it's appropriate to talk about.
Yeah. I think a lot of kind of bemusement, right, in the sense that that was very odd and a bit strange. And yeah, I think a lot of my non-Christian friends, particularly when I think about the friends that I had at Oxford and Cambridge, it's a bit odd, it's a bit funny, a bit strange. And, well, actually, I'll give you one example. I had one Christian friend in Cambridge who has extremely published Christian, Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin, who's written dozens of books.
Yeah, quite a lot of
Brilliant
people
woman.
here have read that book, Confronting Christianity. Yeah.
So, and I think I knew Rebecca in Cambridge, and by the time I became a Christian, this was sort of several years later, and then it was several years again before she kind of got in contact with me. But Rebecca's reaction was, from a Christian standpoint, was, "Gosh, this is really strange." I think I was probably the last person she expected, and I think that probably, goes to be a good description of my non-Christian friends and family too. And I think some of them are still, trying to make sense of it. I guess, yeah.
Okay, I'm just looking at some of these. Sorry, just looking at these questions here. Quite a few people have gone for this one. How do I explain to someone that Christianity is backed up by evidence? So, people say, there's lots of good evidence for Christianity.
Oh, okay.
How might you explain that to someone?
Yeah. I would say that maybe even sort of think about I wonder if the question is even the right one, in the sense that if you think that there's going to be kind of absolute proof for something, in the sense that often behind that question of like, there's evidence and therefore the evidence proves, in the way that I can pour things into a test tube and prove something by an experiment that I can replicate. That scientific model of evidence is never going to work for something which is a worldview. I think the better tact is to say, look, there's all kinds of, but you need to think that evidence is historical evidence, in the sense of when we understand something that happened historically, like we do with any historical figure. I mean, did the Emperor Tiberius live? Here are the sources. What did Tiberius do? Here are the sources. So we're asking different kind of questions, not kind of proof questions. We're not going to prove Christianity precisely because God's given us a mind, I think, because he wants us to wrestle with him, but to make sense of what is the best kind of reliable testimony, and then sort of invite them into this larger question of, even though you think that perhaps the person they're talking to doesn't have a particular set of unfounded assumptions, they do have a worldview. For example, I remember talking to one of my friends once who thought that they had nothing that they believed in that wasn't backed on serious evidence. But then when you push the conversation enough, like gently, you get them to think, like you ask them about something like, do you think you should always be true to yourself? And they're like, yeah. And it's like, where's the evidence? And there's no evidence. You see, these kind of assumptions are not based upon things that you can prove. And so everyone has basic ideas about the world, even if they think they don't have them. So then the real question is, what is the story that best makes sense of life and of the world? And thinking about it that way, I think, enables you to talk about, the historical evidence and the testimony in the Bible, and then invites them to think about the Bible more broadly as a story that makes sense of the human condition. So is it the case, for example, that the Bible's story about the fact that there is a God, there is a purpose, there is an ultimate purpose to human life, we're not just here by accident. We all are inherently precious and created in God's image, and yet deeply, deeply broken and messed up. Yep. Is it the case that we could have all in some way we're trying to set ourselves up as being really the arbiter of what's right and wrong and creating meaning in our own lives? Could it be that there is a God and so forth? And then making sense of those broader questions of Christianity as an explanation that best fits what we know to be the case about human life. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good.
Yep.
That's good. Now, I'm looking at all the questions here. We've talked a bit about history and education and the like. This is a question which is a little down the list, but it's a different one. It's, does history give us insights into how to live in a world increasingly hostile to Christian beliefs? So the world today, increasingly hostile to Christian beliefs. Is there anything which we can learn from history which might help us live in this world?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Partly it's an interesting question because when you look at, so it's really a question that's saying, how have Christians lived historically where they've been persecuted? What have they done in order to preserve the orthodox, like biblical truth of their doctrine, so that they didn't simply kind of completely accommodate what they believed and basically just absorb the culture, to protect who they are, but also to keep witnessing to the culture in a way that's actually true to what the Bible teaches. It's interesting because historically the types of persecution have differed, and at least in contemporary Western societies, there's a kind of different cultural situation today. But I think probably one of the lessons is that historically Christians in times of persecution have really done two things. They have realised how radically different is their calling and is the biblical truth. Like, they have to be different. And I think in that is very helpful today, because what Christians believe and what the Bible teaches today is increasingly going to be out of step with and uncomfortable with the rest of society and in all kinds of ways. But so that's, I think, one thing you can learn. You can learn that from the Bible as well. But historically, the preservation of what the Bible demands. And I think the other thing is that historically, in times of persecution, Christians have built communities that have been focused on trying to encourage one another and build one another up at a time in which, during times in which their societies have been persecuting them. I mean, think even like in ancient history, even when God's people, the Jewish people, are in exile in Babylon, actually what they do is to build community. So I think building community and staying true to orthodox biblical teaching.
Yeah, you mentioned Babylon. At church here, we're currently doing a series in the book of Daniel where Christians are living in Babylon.
Yeah.
And there's an Australian Christian blogger called Stephen McAlpine who sort of compares life for Christians today as being like living in Babylon. So come along to church and see what we say about Daniel. And also the book of Acts is Christians living under persecution as well. Now, I think we've got time for about 2 more questions. I'll just ask 2 more. And here's one from my sheet. This was given to me by someone who is a Christian academic. He says, how should Christians critique academic disciplines? Does that make sense? Do you want more information? So like French history, how would you critique? Now, if we want that unpacked, I can ask the person to unpack it for us.
Well, I think the broad instruction there really is that the Bible gives the picture of who humanity is and what truth is. But it depends what the question, I guess, is really getting at. Because, for example, in the discipline of history, so the methodologies of history and my attempt to understand a particular situation or a journal article that I write, it's not the case that you simply just try to get the Bible into everything. Like, it doesn't alter the actual methodology of history. I wonder whether the question is perhaps asking the broader question of how do you understand perhaps being a historian or being an archaeologist or being an anthropologist, and asking, as I think I tried to hint at earlier, those kind of broader questions. So for me as a historian, what does it mean to do history? I'm trying to understand the kind of broad cultural and civilizational patterns that we see in the world, and the way that I frame those is through the Bible's conceptual vocabulary. So I reflect on what I understand through history in terms of ideas about human failing, and yet the desire to strive for the good, I suppose, at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask a question of my own to finish off.
Okay.
Actually, in 2 parts. A question in 2 parts. First, I'm going to ask you, what are you doing in your historical research at the moment, which you're quite excited about? You know, you're working as an historian. What's exciting you at the moment? Tell us about something which has really captured your
cool.
fancy.
Yeah. Okay, so in my more academic, so I'm working on an academic historical project, but also a kind of book for a general audience about history and how Christians should actually deal with history. But actually, I'll talk about the more academic thing, and then we'll see if we have time for the other one. I'm actually working on the history of the idea of religious liberty in the Australian context. And so I am a historian of ideas. So I'm really interested in this idea of, well, what does it mean to have religious freedom? And one of the things that I'm discovering is that actually religious liberty has been used by all kinds of different groups, not just Christians, but as a kind has been argued for what's basically a kind of natural right for all peoples to protect their freedom to practice religion in Australia's history. So, for example, one of the fascinating events that I've seen is that in 1927, a bunch of stones that were sacred to the Arrente people in Central Australia were stolen, it seems stolen, and brought to Melbourne, and they tried to be sold on the private market. And no one really minded this, except that then in the newspaper, suddenly, about a month or so later, there's this campaign that these stones ought to be returned to the Arrente people. And basically, there are Indigenous Australians, like the famous David Unayapon, who's on the $50 note, making this argument, and allied with a whole bunch of evangelical Christians, including the Archbishop of Melbourne at the time, who was an evangelical. And their argument is essentially that there are fundamental kind of natural rights to practice their religion, and that this enables all people to have the kind of right to seek the truth and to practice it, to seek religious truth. And then they then argue that those stones on that basis are kind of analogous to a cathedral and ought to be returned to the Indigenous people. And one of the reasons why that got me excited was that I realised that in all the kind of discussion about religious freedom in the public sphere, we tend just to think, oh, it's only ever about Christians protecting Christianity. But actually, when you look at the history of this idea, it is an idea which has been able to be used because the idea is that it's a kind of natural right. It's actually an idea which has a rich history that's been able to be used to protect people of different religious persuasions. That's partly why Australia maintains a separation between church and state, where you have freedom to practice a multiplicity of religions and freedom also not to be religious. And there's a fascinating history there that we haven't quite discovered yet.
And I'm going to change part B of my question to ask the question you'd like me to ask, which is, what's this other, project you're working on?
Okay, so that's called Priests of History, Engaging with the Past in an Ahistoric Age. And that's basically about the fact that I think that our current culture is basically an ahistoric culture in which we've lost our ability to engage meaningfully with the past. We're increasingly ignorant of history, and there's a kind of sense in a culture in which the kind of prevailing idea is, what is the good life? Life is basically all about living your best life, creating kind of well-being through and happiness, personal happiness, through being your true self. And that's a kind of culture that can't actually make sense of the past. And we're kind of losing the ability even to think about the ethical complexities of the past, the fact that good and evil coexist in historical figures, from Winston Churchill to Edmund Barton. And so we're living in this kind of ahistorical age. So the book is basically trying to say how, and it's basically written from a Christian perspective, saying how can Christians actually make sense of this? How can Christians live into the story that God gives them, which is that, the story that God gives them in the Bible about who God's people are and redeemed and what we have to do in the world and how we're saved through Jesus. And so how can we actually make sense of and engage with history meaningfully today?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Now, I'm just going to say, just hold your rapturous applause for one moment. I'm just going to conclude now. Just to remind you, you've got those cards. If you'd like to do any of those things we referred to earlier, talk to someone, do the Hope course, come to church, etc., etc. You can either fill in the card and put it in the black box, or you can use the QR code. There are copies of that book, 7 Reasons to Reconsider Christianity, on the table. Please take it if you or someone you know you think could benefit from it. But I'd now like just to say a few very brief thank yous before we head off home. The first one is quite a number of people did quite a bit of work to make tonight happen. Firstly, a lot of people provided supper and particularly Lorraine and Helen and Rebecca did a lot of work to get the supper organised, and there is more supper outside. In fact, it's been indicated to me that if when you leave you want to take some more supper, please do. So a big thank you to everyone on the supper team and who provided food. Also, people helped set... There you clap, please clap. Please clap. Jono and Nairi did some great work on the audio visuals, particularly when we had to sort of be flexible within a basic structure. That was very helpful. And thank you to people who helped set up, and thank you to all of those here who are going to help pack up the chairs afterwards as well. Thank you for our Auslan translators. No, interpreters. That's right, yep, good. And we should thank Sarah's family who are sitting down there and over there for releasing their mother for the night and coming up here, and what a wonderful time they must be having here. So thank you for that. But they've all been given a soft drink each, so that's okay. And then finally, a big thank you to Sarah for coming along and sharing about her life and her thinking. Would you please give her a round of applause?
Thank you.
And here's just a card, which expression of appreciation in there. And so thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me. This has been really a lot of fun.
Okay. Well, that's the end of the evening. Please feel free to make your way home. Be careful, obviously, driving out of the car park. There are a lot of people around. There is more supper. Other than that, I hope you've had a lovely night. I hope you found it stimulating. And I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.